Welcome to Third Floor Views, a production of Chesapeake Family Life, where we talk about health, education, and living with kids. I'm your host, Janet Jefferson. This episode is sponsored by Annapolis Pediatrics. For more than 70 years, Annapolis Pediatrics has provided exceptional healthcare to infants, children, adolescents, and young adults in Annapolis and the surrounding communities. They have over 30 physicians and nurse practitioners to serve your family, and now in 6 locations: Annapolis, Crofton, Edgewater, Severna Park, Kent Island, and Pasadena, which is coming in the spring. Learn more about Annapolis Pediatrics and find helpful parenting resources, videos, and more at AnnapolisPediatrics.com. So today we're talking about the Plummer family, the Riversdale House Museum, and local PG County history. And joining us is Maya Davis, director of Riversdale House Museum, and Marvin Alonzo Greer, who is the lead historic interpretation and community engagement officer for PG County Parks. Thank you so much to both of you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Janet, for having us.
Thank you for having us.
To our viewers, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comments section and we'll get to those as we can. Let's jump right in. So first, I want to hear all about the event. So you have a Plummer's Kitchen event this Sunday, February 20th, so in just 2 days. And I want to hear about what the event is and why everyone should go. So I think, Marvin Alonzo, let's start with you.
So I think I'm just one part of the event. I'll be cooking. This will be my first time cooking for Prince George's County Parks, and I'm really excited that Maya asked me to do this. But I'll be using the Plummer's Kitchen to really talk about foodways and some of the meals that may have been cooked in that kitchen, not just for the enslavers who owned the house, but for also those enslaved families like the Plumbers and the dozens, if not hundreds of enslaved people on that property, what they ate, how they lived, how they survived. And that combination between African foods, European foods, Native American foods, South and Central American foods, and how those all come together to make the American foods we have today. And I think the Plummer's Kitchen really helps us understand that better and understand our lives today. And so I'm really excited to do that and then talk to the public about the commonalities between what we have today in our own kitchens and what we eat today and enslaved people who used food as a way of resistance.
Yeah, American cuisine, I think often when people think about it, they're like, I don't know, it's this mismatch of, I don't even know what it is. But you're right, like that's what makes America so unique and our food so unique, because it is this beautiful fusion of flavors from all over the world. And I think that's what makes it so exciting. So you're gonna actually be physically cooking. You're gonna be making food on Sunday, is that right?
Yes, I'll be dressed in 1812 era attire because that's the time period that we were talking about, maybe a little bit later, 1850s or 60s attire. So from head to foot, over an open hearth, so burning wood, no electronics will be involved, and doing it the same way that if one of the plumbers was a cook, then doing it the same way that they would have done it over 200 years ago. On that same landscape.
So it's going to be a demonstration. So people who come to the house and museum, they'll be able to actually see you in action. Will they be able to taste anything?
Unfortunately, they will not be able to taste anything, although I wish I could feed the public. Unfortunately, for almost all historic sites that you go to, most historic sites don't have their the food licensing to serve like you would at a restaurant. And so it's just for demonstration purposes, unfortunately. But still come out, still see it. You can still walk away with the smells, but then also you'll be leaving with a recipe, so you can actually try some of these recipes at home. They're all taken from historic recipe books that were either written by enslaved people or from those time periods that we're talking about. And so even though we're doing it over an open hearth, you can still use these same recipes at home, practicing with your family, your kids, and doing it over your stovetop, which is probably much easier and faster than
Yes.
standing and more comfortable than standing over an open fire.
What an incredible experience. And you're right. I think the whole sensory experience of the demonstration, everything from smelling it to seeing it and being in the actual place where it all came from. I think it sounds really immersive, and what an amazing way to learn about history. Maya, what else is happening on Sunday? Because Marvin Alonzo said that the cooking is only one part of the event. What else is going on?
Yes, so this will be it's really a hallmark event that happens here at Riversdale on an annual basis. And so it's an opportunity for us to have like an open house.
Mm.
Typically, we have guided tours here over the weekend, but this weekend, people will be able to come into the house with no cost associated with it and actually tour the home. And we'll have volunteers on hand to share information about the home if people have questions.
Mm-hmm. Do people need to sign up?
No, actually, we actually are accepting walk-ins. People can sign up for the event through our website, but we encourage anyone who's in the neighborhood or not in the neighborhood to actually come check us out and see what the history of Riversdale is all about.
It sounds like it's such an amazing event, and to definitely worthwhile to go and check it out. I was wondering, Maya, if you could tell us a little bit more about the Plummer family specifically, and why they are so unique and why everybody in Maryland should know about them.
Oh my goodness, the Plummer family is so amazing. The father, Adam Francis Plummer, was actually owned by George Calvert, who was the owner of the home, along with his wife, Rosalie Steer Calvert. And Adam was born in 1819, and he came to Riversdale from an earlier Calvert property when he was about 10 years old. And he lived and worked here from the time that he came here at 10 until the end of emancipation in Maryland in 1864. And his wife and children, they were actually enslaved at a plantation in Lanham, Maryland called Three Sisters Plantation. And so, we've learned a lot of what we know about Adam, his wife and children, as well as other enslaved individuals, because Adam kept a diary from the day that he married his wife. He actually was allowed to get married in Washington, D.C. at a church. His marriage record is on file with the city archives in D.C. We actually have a copy of it, and we're excited. And his diary has been preserved and is owned by the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum, who has made that information publicly accessible online. And so we know a lot about Adam, his family, and the enslaved community. And it's one of the rare surviving diaries. We have a lot of slave narratives that have been published, but slave diaries are a rarity. And so we are really fortunate that we have this diary that can document the history of Riversdale. And his diary does include information such as birth, marriage, and death of not only the enslaved community, but also the Calvert family, just to kind of show how things were closely intertwined. And, once Adam Francis Plummer actually passed, his daughter, Nellie Arnold Plummer, kept the diary going. She continued to write and document everything. And so we have a long heritage and lineage that we can tie here to Riversdale. And we know that even though his wife and children were enslaved at another site, there were incidents of times when they would have come here and been here at Riversdale.
What an incredible primary source. And I'm thinking about, so I used to be a teacher, and what an amazing way to learn about history, and how you're saying it's such a rare thing to have. And here it is, accessible to the public. So you can come to the house, you can walk on the property, you can experience the cooking and the smells, and then you can read about what life was really like for the Plumbers. Now, did he, in his diary, and Nellie as well, did they talk about how they were feeling in daily life stuff, or was it really more a diary or a journal that talked about sort of the big events?
I think it was pretty general in many ways. One of his daughters had been sold south to Louisiana. He actually documents when he gives his son permission. And I mean, just to know that in slavery, you don't really have as many rights, but he gave his son permission to actually go and seek out his sister and bring her back home once emancipation had taken place. Fully, and not just here in Maryland. And so it just kind of shows the adoration and respect that his family had for him, that they were coming to him. So it wasn't just big events that happened. It was everyday life as he had time to record it. And it's really unique because I really don't think that his owners were always aware that he had the ability to read and write, which is also a rarity amongst enslaved individuals. And we do know from other documentation that another enslaved person had actually exposed him as being able to read and write, and not necessarily in a purposeful manner, but something that was just accidentally shared. But, for him to be able to do that is really telling of the tenacity that he had during the circumstances.
Yeah, the whole story is just incredible. The more I was reading about it, the more I was like, oh my gosh, like this should be something that everybody knows because it is such an incredible story. So it sort of shows the power of place and the importance of the work that you're doing over at Riversdale House. So what role, because I know the story of the Plumbers goes on in terms of after emancipation and bringing the family back together. Looking sort of at the big picture, what role did Riversdale House play in the history of PG County?
Well, Riversdale plays a huge role. We have Rosalie Steer Calvert, which tells an international story. Her father and mother brought their family here from Belgium during the Reign of Terror in Europe under Napoleon. And it tells that story, but then she marries George Calvert, who comes from the lineage of the Calvert family, the Six Lords Baltimore. So we tie into that national story. And then to make it a further bigger story, their son, Charles Benedict Calvert, is the founder of the University of Maryland. So we have three generations of families that lived here, and probably even more generations of families who were enslaved here. And I think slavery, as much as we've tried to write it out of the history books, it's very much a part of our national and global story that we need to tell. And there's just so many things to glean. And what makes me excited is not the history that we've learned all along, but the history that we don't know about yet. And so we continue to try to work in that vein.
Also, there was even though it's on the Calvert's, it winds up becoming on the Calvert's property. The Calvert's property is actually divided into kind of two parcels, and in between, there was a black woman, a free black woman, who owned a tavern, and she had property that separated the Calvert's property. There's actually letters from Rosalie Steer Calvert where she is livid. This black woman, who is free, will not sell her property to the Calverts, and she calls her ill-natured shrew. And so I think the property, I think, really, I think helps not only understand enslavement and the enslavers and the formation of definitely the western part of Prince George's County, but also this relationship between free people of color and their white neighbors, and this idea of the power dynamics and resistance, not just of enslaved people, as we know enslaved people resisted through escaping, through learning how to read and write, through keeping journals, through cooking, but also those free people who were very few in number, but still were literally neighbors, were on what's now property of the Calverts wound up getting her property eventually. But I think that their plantation really spans and tells a huge narrative about Prince George's County and Maryland.
What a fascinating story. That's so crazy. I think it also shows the power of property ownership and, which has huge trickle down effects to today. But if you own property, you have power.
Exactly.
That's such an incredible story. I want to learn a little bit more about the Riversdale House Museum and the work that you're doing right now, Maya, and why everyone needs to come and visit and learn more, and how it's such an important piece of our local history. So I'd love to just hear a little bit more about the museum.
Yes, the museum, we are really going through a transition at this time and making sure that we are being one of those sites that really dedicates their time to telling a balanced narrative. We really want to highlight the voices of individuals who have not been traditionally at the table. And it doesn't mean that we're erasing the story of the Steers and the Calverts. What it means is that we are now going to uplift the voices of those individuals who have been written out of the records intentionally and left out of our interpretation. So we are re-envisioning our interpretation. One of the things that I think is not unique to Riversdale, it's really quite common, not just in Maryland and in our state, is that George Calvert, he was the father of enslaved children. So you not only do you own enslaved children, you are also the parent of enslaved children. And we need to start acknowledging that. And so, it's not just the old content, but like making sure that we as representatives of this house are telling that. One of the other things that we're looking at is that our community has been ever changing. During the period of the 19th century when the Calverts were here, it was a largely white county, but it's also the home of the largest enslaved population in the state. And a lot of people don't know that because Prince George's County today is an extremely diverse community that's largely made up of African Americans and Latinx communities. Our surrounding community has shifted and is now largely Spanish speaking. So we are working to figure out how we can also meet the needs of that community as well, while we're trying to be more transparent about the stories that we're telling and making sure that we are being a real community asset for people in our community. And I think that we can have shared history. And, someone said to me, they were like, well, do you think they will ever come a day where, the African-American community will want to come here? Because a lot of people have sensitive feelings connected to a former plantation home. And do you think that the Latinx community would want to come? Like, would they identify with your history? And I say yes to both. I think a large part of plantation homes being able to connect with African-American communities is that they need to feel seen. And that's what we're prepared to do. And in terms of connecting to Latinx communities, I tell people all the time, I'm a huge traveler. I enjoy traveling quite a bit, and I've been able to travel through Central America and into Mexico. And, no matter your race, creed, or color, I see people at those historic sites from around the world. So we just need to give a reason for people to connect with something. One of my favorite sites is Chichen Itza. And I can't tell you that there was no shortage of diversity there. And I believe that we can achieve the same thing here if people feel a part of what we're doing. And so we are prepared to do that. Marvin Alonzo has been a great part of assisting us in making that connection. And also my team here has undertaken a museum assessment program with one of our primary stakeholders, where we are looking at community and audience engagement and figuring out how we can better connect. And we just finished the assessment program, and now it's time for us to start building on the tangible. So you'll be seeing some new and exciting changes coming up in the next year.
Oh, that's great. I definitely want to get to more about that, because I want to hear more. And I think our audience is really interested in that. I do want to ask you, Marvin Alonzo, a little bit about the role in education that demonstrations play, and particularly what you're doing on Sunday, which you're going to be cooking. How do demonstrations impact the student or viewer or participant, and how does that help you as an educator, as a historian, tell these stories?
Oh, that's a great question. So I have ADD and ADHD. And so like diagnosed, went to schools for kids with special, who had special needs and like needed, so had like learning differences and learning challenges. And so for me, I learned at those schools that like really getting like, it's one thing if a teacher lectures at you and kind of says like, this, you need to learn this because it's important. You need to learn who the Calverts are because they were important to Maryland. But when you're actually like doing something, when you actually get to see, feel, smell, and you have that experimental archaeology, people learn better that way. And it's not just people who have learning differences, but in general. I can't name how many times people said, oh, like I remember going to insert historical site when I was a child. And I have this memory, whether it was Colonial Williamsburg or the Atlanta History Center or a historic site in your hometown. People oftentimes have these memories from school field trips. And the question is why? It's because they saw something. They may not remember what they learned in the classroom, but they remember they had this connection between an old building. They had a connection between seeing sheep or chickens or a garden or something cooking. And it's because we as people, we connect with stories. We are storytelling people. There's a reason we like reality TV. There's a reason we get connected to like Game of Thrones. And it's because these are stories. And it's something that's visible and tangible. And so for me, it's really important having that kind of immersive experience, even though people may not be able to eat the food. But if there are times where people can pick up an egg or pick up a piece of okra that that's something they may not be used to. Like I love when kids come to historic sites and they see like corn growing. Obviously, we're not growing corn at Riversdale just yet, but like if you ask, where does corn come from? Kids are like, a store. You're like, well, where before it comes from a store? I don't know. So you really get to talk to kids about like where the food they eat, where does that come from? And it really helps with this connection between seeing, touching, and doing, because we live in a world where the food just appears on your table, where teachers are unfortunately not given the tools to be able to do those immersive experiences because we are teaching to the test. And unfortunately, more and more schools are cutting back on field trips where those aren't available to schools. But what better way to learn, how better to connect to students to actually, if you really love American history, if you really love world history, if you really want kids to have an appreciation of history, you're going to encourage your school boards, you're going to encourage your teachers, you're going to encourage your politicians to make sure that your students, that your kids are coming to historic sites, because that's supplemental learning. It's not just fun, it's not just a break for the teacher, but you are supplementing that. You're learning about the Calverts, which were important to Maryland's history, but you're also learning about the Plumbers and how that fight for American freedom is just as important, is just as tangible and just as relevant to today's audiences as that fight for freedom that the Calverts may have pushed for in the formation of Maryland and Prince George's County. That being said, you're doing that with an immersive, instead of doing a classroom environment, you're doing that with that immersive environment where kids are able to go walk the gardens and smell the flowers. They're able to see the crown molding. They're able to see the portraits. There's my favorite portrait at Riversdale is one of the is a portrait of one of the Lord Baltimores, and it's him and his grandson and a little enslaved boy. We don't know who that child is, but that child had a name. And imagine if you are an African-American child and Maya is your guide, and she talks to you about, we don't know this child's name, but he's represented in a picture. Far too often, we don't Black and brown people don't see ourselves in the history. Unfortunately, not in our history textbooks for that matter. And so, being able to go into a site where you can see people on the wall and portraits, you can see and hear the stories of something that your ancestors may have done, or people that, even if you're not from the United States, you may have grown up in an area where people cooked very similar to the way they did in the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries. And so being able to relate that to people's lived experiences is extremely important. And so I think that's what really helps this idea of education, and why connecting education to something tangible like cooking, or just like a field trip experience, is so important to the development of young people.
Yeah, I mean, you hit on so many points why it's critical. It helps kids remember. It makes it fun and love learning, and it's going to hit on so many different learning styles, but yet appeals to everyone. And it makes sure that it's telling those different stories, something that we as humans connect to, but actually hearing the different voices of the different people that, as you said, we don't always get that in textbooks. So it just shows the power of experiential learning and the power of a place like Riversdale House Museum. I wanted to ask Maya, and I feel like both both of you have sort of touched on this a little bit, but how do you decide what stories to tell at the museum? You know, because you've got the Plumbers' voices, and then you have the Calverts, but then there's so many other people who were there as well. And it's such the place itself has stories to tell. You've got the garden, which, you know, Marvin Alonzo has touched on, you know, the power of plants and food and the smells. And you have all of these different things, the architecture and the ground itself. You know, how do you decide what to tell, since people are maybe only there for a few hours at a time?
Right. Well, what we've done is we've prioritized people over things, and we know that people like objects and place, but I never want to make anyone feel like the building is more important than the souls who lived and worked here. And so I try to keep that in mind. And we, like I said, we're really updating our interpretation, and we're walking through those spaces and trying to figure out what is the most important story in this space, because every room has an important story. And so in terms of like balancing a narrative, like we're walking through our spaces and re-envisioning what we thought we were going to say before. We do have long-term docents who've been here for years, and you know, it's really hard to just up and re-educate people who kind of know this information from the back of their hand, like they know it inside out, but there's a lot of new information that we're uncovering, and we're going to be excited to share that as well. And so we just have to figure out how to better make space. And I think what Marvin just touched on are those things for different learning styles, and recognizing that everything's not going to show up in an educational opportunity in terms of what we say or what's written, but it may be an object that they come in contact with. And so thinking about creative ways to tell the story of the enslaved, like we do have portraits in our collection that we display. We have in our dining room, we have original Calvert pieces of dishes. We have different chairs and things. But, you know, as we think about those things being Calvert owned, we know that enslaved communities had to work with those objects every day. Like, who was the person who polished the furniture? Who was the person that actually built the house? Who was the person that made the bricks? Who was the person that washed the different dishes? Who served the Calverts in their company? And so I think that we have a good opportunity to revise how we've told the story, and that's what we're working on now. And we try to do a better job at telling that. Like as I shared earlier, like I think it's important that we say that George Calvert is not just the father of 9 children; he's actually the father of 11 children that we know of. We have to say that and do our due diligence in making sure that we're very careful with language. I think language is probably the most part of the educational experience that comes out of this, and making sure that, you know, we recognize our audience that's before us, because there will be times when we have adults that are coming in, we will have children coming in, and so we will have to customize it for each group that's coming in. But I don't think that it's undoable, and I think that we have a great opportunity. One of the things that we're toying with now is building in a Spanish language tour so that we can actually better connect with our community, and I think that's going to be very exciting and will help us not only build with community, but make this feel like a home the way that it does for all the other residents that live in and around Riverdale Park. We have people that come and utilize our grounds regularly every day, whether that be for an afternoon jog. There's kids that come here and they may kick their ball around a little bit. There's people that come and walk their dogs. You know, we have like the run of the mill. So, you know, we want those people that are coming and just visiting the grounds to come indoors and learn who we are and what we are.
Now, I have one last question for both of you. I want to hear a little bit about exciting things that's on the horizon, both for Riversdale House, but then also for sort of PG County parks in general. So Maya, I'll start with you and Riversdale House Museum. What's coming up? What can make sure that people don't miss?
Things that we have coming up is next month is Women's History Month. And I won't jump to Women's History Month just yet, because we also have on display currently during Black History Month and going into March, the quilt of Dr. Joan Gaither, who created the Maryland Emancipation Quilt in 2014 and worked with communities across the state. It is a beautiful quilt, and I would implore anyone to come out and see it while it's on display. And in March, we actually have a book club that we're kicking off, and we'll be reading My Monticello. And so we want people to come out and be a part of that conversation as well. And one of the things I'm most excited about, which is probably less of a public ordeal, but we are working with our descendant community to build a descendant community. We have one descendant that we've worked with for a very long time, Dr. Jerome Fowler, who's descended from the Plumbers, who's been very active, and we're working on an exhibition about the enslaved community here at Riversdale. And through him, we've been able to connect with more Plummer descendants, but we've recently discovered a few descendants from other enslaved individuals who lived and worked here that we didn't have before. So we're really excited to see how we can engage the descendant community and also have them help shape who we are and what we do and how we represent ourselves to the public.
That does sound really exciting. Maya, do you have any best guess on when that exhibit might be up and running?
The exhibition will be slated to open in fall of 22. It will open this year, and we are excited to do that. We've built out a focus group that includes scholars, descendants, and volunteers who've been here to kind of think about audience engagement, to think about the messaging and all those things, and what imagery and objects will best speak to us telling the story of the enslaved who lived and worked here. So we're truly excited.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. Thank you. Marvin Alonzo, how about you? What are some things that people should not miss around PG Parks that's coming up this spring?
This spring, I'll even start like right now. Our Black History program has an exhibit up celebrating the 40th anniversary of our Black History program. That's at Abraham Hall, so definitely check that out. The Surratt House Museum is doing amazing things, very similar to Maya. They are really updating their interpretation, kind of moving away from that lost cause narrative that was so prevalent throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s, even up until the 21st century. And so they're really kind of digging in and discovering some of those enslaved stories, but also re-examining the plot and successful execution of to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. And so they're really doing some really good stuff there at the Surratt House. Also check out, especially if you're visiting Riversdale, check out the College Park Aviation Museum. They're doing some really innovative things there. I know they just had a program, and they'll be doing it again this year in 2020, called oh my God, it was Latinas in Aviation. And they brought in Latina aviators from all around the country, and they did a fly-in, and the public got to meet these pilots, these women pilots. And again, like Maya was talking about, ways to engage our Latina and Latino brothers and sisters in this community, and they're really doing that. And then a project that I'm working on that should be rolling out this spring is the Sankofa Mobile Museum. And it's going to be a museum on wheels that's going to use Prince George's County history and individuals that aren't necessarily big names, but still people that are like you and me, everyday individuals who made a huge impact on Prince George's County, some from the past, some from today. And that's going to travel around not just Prince George's County, but the DMV, using history to teach social activism and how each of us can make an impact on our community.
Oh, amazing. And then where should people go if they want to make sure that they catch that?
For the mobile museum, we're still developing that, but you can definitely check us out on our website at pgparks.org. I believe it's pgparks.org. Correct, Maya? Yeah, pgparks.org. And you'll definitely see updates there, as well as follow us on Facebook at PG Parks History.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to both of you, to Maya Davis and Marvin Alonzo Greer, for joining us today. And thank you also to all of our viewers and listeners and our sponsor, Annapolis Pediatrics. Make sure that you visit ChesapeakeFamily.com for up-to-date local information on home, health, and living for today's Maryland parent. This episode will be archived on ChesapeakeFamily.com in video and podcast format. And there will also be a list of resources that we discussed. So if you want to check out some of these incredible events, make sure you look at the links there. I'm Janet Jefferson with Chesapeake Family Life and Third Floor Views. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janet.
Thank you, Janet.